A wealthy Arab businessman acquires a struggling single mother at an exclusive event, expecting her to bear his child. But what he uncovers later leaves him stunned. Lila, a young woman burdened by life's relentless challenges, found herself with no other option but to attend a secretive, high-stakes auction where women were presented to elite bidders. For her, this wasn't about choice, it was survival. Seated in a dimly lit corner of an opulent hall, Lila felt the crushing weight of her reality. Her heart pounded with fear and uncertainty, but thoughts of her son, Ayan, anchored her. He was staying with a kind, elderly neighbor that night, unaware of the desperate measures his mother was taking. The overdue bills, the looming eviction, and the nights when Ayan went to bed hungry had driven her to this moment. A man in an impeccable suit, the event's host, approached her with a carefully measured smile. "Stay composed, Lila. Keep your smile pleasant and avoid making direct eye contact with the guests," he instructed before walking away. The room was filled with powerful men, their gazes scanning each woman like rare treasures on display. When Lila's name was called, her stomach twisted. "Lot number 23, the host announced in a polished, theatrical tone. Lila's legs trembled as she stepped onto the stage, the glaring lights momentarily blinding her. The heat from the spotlights made her skin glisten with nervous sweat. She tried to maintain her posture, but the predatory stares made her feel exposed and vulnerable. "A rare beauty," the host continued, using words that only deepened Lila's discomfort. A murmur of interest rippled through the audience. Then a deep, commanding voice cut through the chatter. $1 million. Silence fell over the room. All eyes turned toward the man seated in the back row. His presence was undeniable. Tanned skin, piercing eyes, and an aura of authority that demanded respect. Karim Al-Fayed, a reclusive billionaire known for his wealth and discretion, had made the bid. The host, caught off guard by the immediate offer, repeated the sum. No other bids followed. "Sold," he declared, a satisfied grin spreading across his face. Lila's legs felt weak, but she forced herself to keep her composure as she stepped off the stage. Her life had just taken an irreversible turn. Karim approached her, his expression unreadable. "We need to discuss the terms," he said calmly, extending his hand to guide her. Hesitating but knowing there was no escape, Lila followed him into a private room where her fate would be sealed. The space was grand yet intimidating. Karim gestured for her to sit before retrieving an envelope from a polished table. "This is the contract," he said, handing it to her. "Read it carefully." Lila's hands trembled as she unfolded the document. The silence in the room was suffocating. As her eyes scanned the clauses, her breath grew unsteady. Then, she reached the critical section. "You expect me to have a child and leave it with you?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Karim folded his arms, his expression unwavering. "I need an heir. Once the child is born, you will leave. The contract makes that clear." Lila shot up from her seat, a mix of anger and fear surging through her. "I can't do this. I won't abandon my own child." Karim's gaze darkened, but his voice remained controlled. "You knew what this arrangement was when you stepped into that auction? There's no room for second thoughts now." Lila clutched the contract, her fingers digging into the paper. "This is inhumane," she spat. "Do you really think you can just buy a child and discard the mother?" Karim took a step closer, his towering presence almost suffocating. "I paid $1 million for you, Lila. This isn't a game. You have no choice." Her heart pounded in her chest. She was trapped. Karim placed a pen on the table in front of her. "Sign it. Once the baby is born, you'll receive your payment and be free to move on with your life." Lila stared at the contract, her hands shaking with a storm of emotions. Anger, sorrow, helplessness. Thoughts of Ayan filled her mind. She was doing this for him. Tears threatened to spill, but she swallowed them down. "This isn't right," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Karim leaned in, his gaze sharp. "What's right or wrong doesn't matter. Only that the agreement is honored." Lila exhaled shakily. She had no way out. With a heavy heart, she picked up the pen and signed. Kareem took the contract and nodded. "Tomorrow morning, we'll complete the necessary medical procedures. After that, you'll be taken to my estate. Get some rest." Without another word, he walked out, leaving Lila alone with her regrets. Her eyes dropped to the signature on the paper, feeling as though she had just signed away her soul. The next day, a sleek black limousine idled outside her small apartment. Saying goodbye to Ayaan had been agonizing. She had told him she had to work far away for a while, promising to call whenever she could. Her son, blissfully unaware of the storm brewing around them, waved with a bright smile. The ride to the estate was silent. Lila gazed out of the window, watching the city fade into vast golden deserts, then into a world of opulence beyond her imagination. When they arrived, the grand estate took her breath away. Towering iron gates opened to reveal sprawling gardens and a mansion straight out of a dream. Kareem stood at the entrance, his expression as unreadable as ever. He led her inside, briefly explaining the rules of the house. "Your privacy will be respected, but I expect you to fulfill your part of the contract without issue," he stated firmly. With that, he left her in the care of Amira, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes. "If you need anything, I'll be nearby," Amira said warmly as she showed Lila to her room. The space was elegant, filled with soft, neutral tones. On the bed lay a selection of luxurious clothing and accessories, starkly contrasting her humble life before. Lila sat on the edge of the plush mattress, staring blankly ahead. She had traded her freedom for survival. But at what cost? Lila offered a small smile of gratitude, but deep down she couldn't shake the feeling of being an outsider in this grand, unfamiliar place. That night, as she stood on her balcony, staring out at the distant horizon, her thoughts drifted to Ayaan. The ache of being away from him was suffocating, but she clung to the belief that she was doing what was necessary to secure his future. A gentle knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. It was Kareem. "Tomorrow, we'll visit my personal doctor," he informed her in his usual composed manner before turning to leave. Lila simply nodded, her heart sinking. With every passing moment, the weight of her decision grew heavier, but there was no turning back now. The next morning she awoke early. The mansion was silent. Too silent. Instead of comfort, the stillness felt unsettling. Her first night there had been restless, plagued by thoughts of the unknown future ahead. The bed was luxurious, the sheets impossibly soft, but peace was nowhere to be found. Soon, Amira knocked on her door, ready to escort her to the doctor. As they walked through the grand estate, Lila couldn't help but take in her surroundings. Endless hallways adorned with Persian rugs, walls decorated with paintings from renowned artists, and enormous windows that overlooked perfectly manicured gardens. Before she could absorb it all, they stepped into a sleek limousine that would take them to their destination. The clinic was housed in a modern high-rise in the heart of Dubai. Inside, they were greeted by Dr. Ibrahim, a man with a calming presence and a reassuring voice. He conducted a thorough examination before offering his assessment. "Everything looks perfect. We can proceed with the first stage of the process," he confirmed. Lila gave a small nod, suppressing the unease rising in her chest. Throughout it all, Kareem remained detached, watching from a distance with his usual composed demeanor. To him, this was merely another step toward fulfilling an obligation. But for Lila, it was something far more painful. A stark reminder that in 9 months she would have to walk away from a part of herself. Back at the mansion, she tried to distract herself by exploring its vast rooms. Each space was more extravagant than the last. There was a library with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, an indoor pool surrounded by marble pillars, and a music room filled with exotic instruments. Yet despite the splendor, the place felt hollow, soulless. Kareem, for all his wealth, seemed to live a life marked by solitude. He rarely smiled, and even his acts of courtesy felt measured and distant. During the first few days, Their interactions remained purely transactional. Kareem ensured that everything followed the terms of their agreement, but he never attempted to engage with her on a personal level. Lila, on the other hand, felt increasingly out of place. Her nights were spent staring at the ceiling, wondering how Ayan was doing. Her mornings were filled with the harsh reality that soon she would carry a child that she could never claim as her own. By the second week, Kareem hosted a formal dinner at the mansion for his business associates. As part of the agreement, Lila was expected to accompany him. Dressed in an elegant gown selected for her, she descended the grand staircase with careful steps, feeling every pair of eyes on her. Some guests greeted her politely, while others exchanged glances that made her feel exposed. Kareem, however, stayed by her side the entire time. "This is Lila, my special guest," he introduced her with ease. At one point, as they stepped aside for a moment of reprieve, he leaned in slightly. "Are you all right?" he asked, a rare flicker of concern in his voice. Lila hesitated before responding honestly. "I'm trying to adjust." He gave a slight nod but said nothing more. For Kareem, these events were routine, a necessity. For Lila, it was a plunge into a world she didn't understand. That night, exhausted, she retreated to her room. Before sleeping, she called her neighbor to check on Ayan. Hearing her son's cheerful voice was both comforting and painful. She wiped away silent tears as she listened to him chatter about his day, forcing herself to sound strong for him. As the days passed, Lila began to notice small things about Kareem that contradicted his cold exterior. He was strict and calculating, but there were fleeting moments where he seemed human. One afternoon, she found him alone in the garden, carefully tending to a delicate plant. It was the first time she had seen him do something so personal. "This plant belonged to my mother," he explained, noticing her curious gaze. She always said caring for it brought her peace. For the first time, Lila felt a spark of understanding. Beneath Kareem's rigid demeanor, there was something else, someone else. Perhaps he too carried wounds that had never fully healed. Amira, the housekeeper, also grew more open with Lila. During quiet afternoons, she shared stories about Kareem's past, how he had taken over his family's empire at a young age after losing his parents. The more Lila learned, the more she began to understand the man who had once seemed untouchable. Yet, despite this growing awareness, she remained distant. She reminded herself that her time in the mansion was temporary, that she could not afford to become attached to the place or the people in it. Still, in the solitude of her evenings, she found comfort in quiet walks through the garden or gazing at the stars from her balcony. One evening, there was another unexpected knock at her door. When she opened it, Kareem stood there, not as imposing as usual. There was something different about him. "We need to talk," he said, stepping inside. Lila sat down, expecting another set of instructions or terms. But instead, Kareem seemed uncertain, as if struggling with what he wanted to say. "I know this arrangement hasn't been easy for you," he finally admitted. "I don't intend to make it harder." He paused before adding, "I just wanted you to know that despite everything, I respect your courage." Lila blinked, momentarily taken aback. His words were unexpected. For the first time, she saw something in his eyes she hadn't noticed before: vulnerability. The moment was brief, but it left a mark. As Kareem left the room, Lila found herself thinking about their conversation, unable to ignore the small shift between them. For the first time since arriving at the mansion, she questioned everything she had assumed about him. Perhaps Kareem wasn't as heartless as she had believed. Perhaps, beneath the hardened shell, he was just as broken as she was. Lila couldn't ignore the faint possibility, however distant, that there was more to uncover in her relationship with Kareem. Life at the mansion moved at an unhurried pace, yet each passing day added a new layer to the complex dynamic between them. They were like mismatched puzzle pieces, forced into a situation neither had fully chosen, trying to find a way to coexist. As time moved forward, The reality of what was to come loomed over Lila. Soon, she would be carrying Kareem's child. The thought unsettled her, but it also ignited a quiet curiosity. Who was the man who had asked her to make such a profound sacrifice? The days settled into a rhythm, though the weight of her circumstances never truly lifted. Lila began to notice the small details around her, subtle routines, hidden corners of the mansion, and the quiet patterns of life in her new reality. The garden became her sanctuary, a place where she could feel the sun's warmth and listen to the soft trickle of water from the stone fountains. It was one of the few places that offered her a moment of peace. She wasn't the only one drawn to its tranquility. Kareem often spent time there as well, though he never initiated conversation. Yet, Lila could sense his quiet awareness of her presence. There was an unspoken tension between them, something both acknowledged but neither addressed. One afternoon, as she strolled through the garden, she noticed Kareem carefully pruning a tree. He sensed her watching and glanced up briefly before returning to his task, making it clear he wasn't expecting a conversation. "Do you enjoy gardening?" Lila asked, breaking the silence. "It helps me clear my mind," he replied without looking at her. There was something in his voice, not dismissive but guarded. It wasn't much, but it was a glimpse past the walls he had built around himself. Lila chose not to push further, but she couldn't ignore the growing intrigue surrounding the man who seemed to exist between discipline and solitude. That evening, she was caught off guard when Kareem joined her at the dinner table. Until then, she had eaten alone, with meals quietly delivered by Amira, the housekeeper. His presence at the table was unexpected, carrying an air of quiet authority. "Are you adjusting?" he asked as he poured himself a glass of wine. Lila hesitated before responding. "As much as I can," she said carefully. Kareem studied her for a moment as though searching for something in her expression. "I know this situation isn't easy," he said, "but I hope you understand that it's necessary." Lila wanted to ask, necessary for whom? But she kept the thought to herself, choosing silence instead. There was something in his tone that suggested he carried his own burdens, ones he never spoke of. As weeks passed, Lila noticed small gestures of kindness from Kareem. He was never openly affectionate, but his actions spoke in quiet ways. One day, after she had casually mentioned missing a dish from her homeland, Amira appeared with a tray of carefully prepared meals. "Mr. Kareem requested these for you," she explained with a kind smile. Lila was surprised but said nothing. Kareem remained distant, yet he noticed things. He remembered details she barely thought twice about. One morning, she woke to find a neatly arranged stack of books on her bedside table, stories and novels she had once mentioned in passing. A warmth settled in her chest. He had been paying attention. Then, one evening, as she wandered past the music room, soft piano notes drifted down the hall. The door was slightly open, and curiosity pulled her forward. Peering inside, she found Kareem seated at the grand piano, his fingers moving over the keys with practiced ease. "You play?" she asked, stepping inside. Kareem looked up, startled to be caught in such an unguarded moment. "My mother taught me," he admitted, pulling his hands away from the keys. "It's beautiful," Lila murmured, stepping closer. He averted his gaze, as if uncertain how to respond to the compliment. In that brief moment, she saw something she hadn't before. Traces of a man who once belonged to something softer, something more personal than the cold, calculated life he lived now. Another time, as she strolled through the garden, a sudden rustling in the trees caught her attention. A small bird tumbled from a branch, landing awkwardly on the ground. It was clearly injured. Without hesitation, Lila knelt, gently scooping the fragile creature into her hands. Kareem appeared soon after, watching her with quiet curiosity. "What will you do with it?" he asked, his voice neutral. Lila glanced down at the small, injured bird cradled in her hands. "I'll take care of it until it's strong enough to fly again," she replied firmly. He didn't say anything at first, but there was something in his gaze, something almost like admiration. That small act of kindness seemed to affect him in a way Lila hadn't expected. Nights in the mansion remained lonely, but she found comfort in small routines. She often wandered the vast corridors, letting herself admire the intricate details of the architecture. One evening, as she walked through the dimly lit hallway, she unexpectedly crossed paths with Kareem. He looked tired, his features softer than usual. "Can't sleep?" he asked. Lila hesitated before answering. "Sometimes it's hard when there's so much on my mind." He nodded as if he understood completely. To her surprise, he extended an invitation. "Join me for some tea in the library." Seated among rows of books, they talked longer than they ever had before. It was a quiet, unexpected moment of connection. And in that moment, Lila realized she was beginning to see beyond the mask Kareem wore. The household staff noticed the shift too. Amira, who had always been warm, now treated Lila more like a friend than just a guest. Even Kareem, though still guarded, seemed different, more at ease in her presence. And Lila, she began to feel less alone. Despite the contract that had brought her here, despite the weight of the circumstances surrounding them, she found herself drawn to the moments of unexpected connection within the seemingly lifeless mansion. But she never let herself forget that it was temporary. As the first cracks in their distance began to appear, Lila knew she had to be prepared for what lay ahead. Kareem was a complex man, and she was only beginning to understand the layers beneath his composed exterior. Time continued to pass, and despite her best efforts to remain detached, Lila found herself increasingly immersed in the life of the mansion. Small moments with Kareem left a deeper impression than she wanted to admit, and in turn, he seemed to show a growing, though controlled, interest in understanding her. One evening, during a quiet conversation in the garden, he surprised her with a confession. "I see in them the future," he said, referring to the plants he carefully tended. "Something that needs to be nurtured with love and responsibility." The words stayed with her. She had spent so long assuming that Kareem was a man of rigid expectations, a man who sought control above all else. But in that moment, she realized he had layers she had yet to uncover. Over time, small gestures brought them closer. Kareem began asking about her interests, her favorite books, the things that made her feel at ease. And Lila, despite her hesitation, found herself responding, sharing small glimpses of her life before all of this. The conversations in the garden became routine, as did their evenings in the library, where they would exchange books and discuss stories. One night, Kareem asked a question that caught her off guard. "If you could change anything about your past, what would it be?" Lila paused, considering her answer. "I think I would have chosen more wisely. The people I trusted," she admitted. "But at the same time, I don't know if I would change everything. Without my mistakes, I wouldn't have Ayan." Her son's name hung in the air like a fragile thread between them. Kareem seemed to sense the weight of her words and shifted the conversation, giving her space. Despite the growing sense of connection, Lila still felt unsure. The contract remained between them, like an invisible barrier, one that couldn't be ignored. No matter how much she was beginning to understand Kareem, she couldn't let herself forget the reality of their arrangement. Their time together was limited. One evening, as Lila stood on her balcony staring at the endless sky, Kareem joined her. They sat in silence, simply watching the stars. "You think a lot about the future, don't you?" he asked. Lila exhaled softly. "I can't help it," she admitted. "All of this feels temporary." Kareem turned to her, and for a brief moment their eyes met. There was something in his gaze, something that made her hold her breath.